Hello everyone, in today's tutorial I'm going to be teaching you how to sew this high-low wrap coat dress using my Tory pattern, which you can find in the description box. Look at this lovely drape and the way that it blows in the wind. Ooh-wee! Alright, let's go ahead and jump into the materials that you will need. First thing that we need to do is stay stitch our skirt pieces. So that's pattern piece number 3 and 4. So up top on the waist edge, you're going to do a stay stitch using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Alright, to do the stay stitch, go ahead and line up the top edge with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Lower your needle, and you don't have to do a back stitch on either end. You could just go ahead and start sewing. Alright, after you have stay stitched the upper edges, I'm going to go ahead and serge my raw edges because my fabric tends to fray a lot. If you don't have a serger, you can use a zigzag stitch. Alright, next what you can go ahead and do is lay out your 2 front skirt pieces with the right sides facing up. You want to grab 2 of your pockets. And we're going to be working on the side of the front, and you'll be able to tell the side because it is the longest side. So this is the side seam, and this is going to be the front of the skirt. And you can also tell that it's the side seam because there are 2 notches on the sides where we will line up our pockets. So what you want to do is go ahead and take your pockets and lay them with the right sides to the right side of the skirt piece. And then what you want to do is find the notch in the pocket and find the side notch in the skirt. And you want to line those up and you want to pin in place. Alright, after you have put these 2 pins in there, you can add some additional pins along the pocket. Alright, so after you're done with this, you'll do the same thing to this other front piece. Alright, starting at either end of the pocket, either the top or the bottom, depending on which side you're working with, you want to line up the edge of the pocket with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Go ahead and lower your needle, and because we're just basting, there's no need to backstitch. You could just start sewing. Alright, next go ahead and lay out your back pattern piece, the back skirt pattern piece, with the right side facing up. And then you can take your pockets and we're going to lay them with the right side facing the right side of the skirt. And similar to the front pattern pieces, we're going to line up the notches in the pocket with the notches in our skirt and pin those in place. And then add additional pins. Pin the other side the same way and then take it to your sewing machine and baste it down in place using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Alright, after you have attached your pockets, make sure that you go ahead and press the pocket going away from the skirt. So press that down on both the back piece and also on the 2 front pieces. Alright, after you have your pockets nicely pressed, go ahead and lay out the back pattern piece with the right side facing up. Grab your front pieces and we're going to lay these with the right sides facing each other. So you want to match up the pocket Also match up the side seam. Alright, when pinning up this side seam, the way I like to line everything up first is to make sure that the seams for the pockets are lined up with each other at the top. And then I go ahead and place a pin there to hold it. Then I also like to check right here at the bottom of the pocket, making sure that the seams are lined up. And you can I can feel it with my thumb that the seams are together. And then I place a pin there to hold it in place. And next, what I go ahead and do, starting at the bottom, I just go ahead and start adding pins. Next, go ahead and pin along the pocket area. Alright, next we need to find those notches that we made and place pins there. So we have a bottom notch in the pocket. So where we made that snip, go ahead and place a pin. And then there should also be a top notch in the pocket. So find that snip and place a pin. Alright, starting at the bottom edge of the skirt, go ahead and line up the edge with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Lower your needle. Go ahead and begin sewing and backstitch. And we're going to keep sewing up until we get to that bottom notch in our pocket. All right, once you reach that bottom notch, go ahead and lift up your presser foot. Make sure that your needle is still inside of your fabric. Go ahead and turn. And you want to get your pocket back lined up with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and you want to keep sewing. Alright, to finish off this pocket, what you want to go ahead and do is, starting at the top edge, we're going to start at the top edge of the pocket. And you want to line up this seam with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So then go ahead and lower your needle. Begin sewing and backstitch. And we're going to keep sewing until we get to this top notch in the pocket. Once you reach that pin marking the top notch, go ahead and backstitch. Sew forward again, and then backstitch. Alright, once you are finished sewing the side seam, what you want to do is press the seam going towards the front piece of the skirt. So on the pocket and down here, make sure you're pressing the whole seam going towards the front of the skirt piece. Alright, to keep your pockets in place, go ahead and make sure that the pocket is going towards the front of the skirt piece, and then in between the top edges of the pocket, we're going to baste there to hold it down in place. Okay, next what you want to go ahead and do is lay out the back bodice piece with the right side facing up. Now what we're going to do is add an ease stitch at the shoulder edge of the back bodice piece. That way we can ease the shoulder to match up with our front. pattern pieces. Now I did, before I did that, what I went ahead and did was I serged the shoulder edges and also the bottom edge of my bodice on my back and also on my front pieces. I did that. Alright, to do the E-stitch, go ahead and turn your stitch length to the longest length on your machine. So for me that is a stitch length of 4.5. Go ahead and lower your needle. No need to backstitch, and I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm just going to sew until I get to the other side. Alright, when you get to the other side, no need to backstitch. Alright, next what you want to go ahead and do is at one of the ends, grab, you'll see you have 2 tails of thread. You want to grab one of the tails and you just want to gently pull it just a little bit. Okay, and that's going to create a gathering effect. And you don't have to pull it too much because we don't need that much of an ease for it to fit our shoulder. So once you've gathered it a bit, what you want to do is now take the front pieces and you want to lay them right sides together. And I see that what I've pulled, and see I just did a little bit, not a lot, and now I see that my shoulders are lined up with each other. So what I'm going to do is, so that all of the gather isn't just in one place, I'm just going to distribute that evenly across the top. And line up the notches in the shoulder, place a pin there, and then continue adding pins. Alright, so you want to repeat the process on the other side. Alright, next go ahead and line up the shoulder with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Lower your needle. Begin sewing and backstitch. And keep sewing until you get to the end and backstitch again. Alright, you're going to repeat this process on the other shoulder, and then you can take this to your iron and press the seam open. Alright, next go ahead and grab your sleeve. Make sure that the wrong side of the sleeve is facing up. You can grab a seam gauge or you can use an index card. If you use an index card, measure from the bottom up 1/2 inch and then draw a 1/2 inch line. Then what you want to do is take your index card, and you'll do this at your iron. You'll, looking at the bottom edge, you'll fold it up to meet that 1/2 inch line. You'll take your iron and press. And you'll do that across the entire bottom. Once it has been pressed once, what you'll do now is take the edge and you'll fold it one more time inward. Alright, and then we will, once you have it pressed down, we'll take it to our sewing machine and do a top stitch. Alright, to do the top stitch, go ahead and, with the right side facing up, place the sleeve edge at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Lower your needle, begin sewing, and backstitch. Alright, keep sewing until you get to the end and backstitch again. Alright, go ahead and take this to your iron and give it a nice press. Alright, after you finish the bottom of the sleeve, what we're going to do is do an E-stitch along the top edge of the sleeve, and we'll do an E-stitch using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Alright, to do the E-stitch, go ahead and use the longest stitch on your machine. I'm using a 4.5. Next, go ahead and line up one end of the sleeve with 1/2 inch seam allowance, and make sure that you have a tail of threads at the end. Then go ahead and lower your needle. No need to backstitch. And you're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. And when you get to the end, no need to backstitch. Just make sure that you leave a tail of threads at the end as well. Alright, next go ahead and lay out your bodice. Right now I'm looking at the wrong side of the fabric. This is the front bodice piece and this is the back. And also lay out your sleeve with the wrong side facing up. And make sure that it's the appropriate sleeve. So you should have one notch lining up here. And you just want to double check before you start pinning. And that 2 notches here line up with the 2 notches in the back bodice piece. So go ahead and grab your pins. The first thing that you want to do is find that notch in the sleeve, the top one, and you want to line it up with the shoulder seam. So with right sides facing each other, go ahead and pin that in place. Now next what you want to go ahead and do is grab your ease stitches, and you'll notice that there are 2 threads. You're only going to be pulling one of them. So I'm going to pull the top thread, and what I'm going to do is just gently begin pulling, and you see it's creating a gathering effect similar to our shoulder. And you just want to pull on those ease stitches. Now I'm going to see if I've pulled it enough. So I'm just going to do a test without pinning anything to line up the 2 notches in the sleeve with the 2 notches in the bodice. Alright, and I see that I've pulled it just enough. I'm going to go ahead and pin at the 2 notches. And I'm going to just a little bit more distribute my gathers. And once you like the way that your ease stitches have been distributed, you can go ahead and add some additional pins in there. Next, go ahead and repeat this process on the other side. Alright, go ahead and line up the sleeve with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Go ahead and lower your needle and begin sewing. Backstitch. And keep sewing until you get to the end and backstitch again. Now it's okay to take your time on this part, especially trying to maneuver around the curve of this sleeve. So don't feel like you need to rush on this part. Take your time. And when I get to the area that has the ease stitches, I like to just really take my time and make sure that my fabric is even and that I don't have any lumps, so I don't create any so I'm not sewing over an extra layer of fabric or anything. So really make sure that when you get to the ease stitch that you make sure everything is nice and flat before you begin sewing on top of it. Alright, next you could take this to your iron and press the seam going towards the sleeve. Now before I press this out, I'm going to take this to my serger and I'm going to serge this edge. Alright, next go ahead and grab your belt loops. And with the right sides on the inside, you're going to fold the belt loop in half. And then you can place some pins along the edge. Alright, next to sew this up, we're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance. But in order to do that, we're going to have the side that's on the fold be facing towards the seam. Be facing towards the seam. All right, with the folded edge lined up with 1/2 inch seam allowance, go ahead and lower your needle, begin sewing, and backstitch. And keep sewing till you get to the end and backstitch again. All right, to turn your belt loop, go ahead and take your loop turner, push it through your fabric. Then you want to latch it onto the fabric. And once it's latched, you can begin pulling the fabric through. And then once it starts coming out on the other side, you can take the turner off. And then just with your other hand, just begin pulling the rest of it out. And then once it's all on the right side, you can go ahead and take this to your iron and give it a nice press. All right, another option for the belt loop, if you don't have a loop turner or turning is a challenge for you, what you can do is take your belt loop, you want to fold it together, make sure that the right side is facing out and the wrong side is on the inside. You're folding it in half. Go ahead and take it to your iron. You're going to press that in place. That'll create a crease in the center. Then you'll take the outsides, fold it in to take the outsides, fold it in to meet that crease. And then you can press that with your iron. Then you'll fold these to meet each other, and that will create your belt loop. And you can press this in place, and then you can take it to your sewing machine and sew a stitch along the edge to secure the belt loop. All right, next go ahead and lay out the bodice piece, the back bodice, with the right side facing up. So working on the right side of the fabric. Grab your pins and your belt loop. Now those 2 dots on the side, what you want to do is take one end of the belt loop, and on that dot you want to go ahead and place the belt loop on top, and then you're going to pin that down in place. Then you're going to take the other end of the belt loop and just turn it, or curve it, so that it meets the dot on the other side. And then you're going to place a pin there. All right, to attach the belt loop, go ahead and change your stitch to a basting stitch. So I'm using a 4.5 stitch length. And then starting at the top belt loop, go ahead and lower your needle. And there's no need to backstitch, just go ahead and start sewing. And I am using a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance to baste this belt loop. All right, once you get past the belt loop, you can just go ahead and stop. No need to backstitch, raise your needle. All right, and you can go ahead and baste the other belt loop the same exact way. So you're going to, at the shoulder seam, go ahead and pick up your bodice. And then now you'll see that it's creating the sleeve, and then now the bodice piece. So what we're going to do is begin pinning along this edge. So the first thing you want to do is line up. You want to line up the shoulder seam here in the arm, in the underarm, and place a pin there. Next, you want to match up the notches in the sleeve and place a pin there. And then you also want to line up the sleeve here at the end and place a pin. All right, and then you can add some additional pins in this area. Alright, next go ahead and match up the notches here in the bodice. Match up the ends of the bodice together. And then next go ahead and add some additional pins. Alright, starting at the bottom of the bodice, line up the edge with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Lower your needle. Go ahead and begin sewing and backstitch. Alright, keep sewing until you reach the other end and backstitch again. Alright, next what I'm going to do is go ahead and serge this edge, and then I'm going to take it to my iron and press it going towards the back of the sleeve and towards the back of the bodice. Alright, next what you want to go ahead and do is lay out the skirt piece and make sure that the right side of the fabric is facing up. What you want to do is take your bodice piece, and I'm looking at the bottom edge of the bodice. You want to lay it now with the right sides touching together. So next we want to go ahead and pin these in place. So the first pin that you want to place is at the side seam. So match up the side seam of the bodice with the side seam of the pocket, where the pocket is. Alright, next you want to pin at the center back. So the center back of the bodice and also the center back of the skirt piece. Line those up and pin in place. Alright, next you want to line up the other side seam. Alright, now I'm going to pin the ends together. Right, next I'm going to add some additional pins along this edge. Alright, go ahead and line up your seam with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Lower your needle, begin sewing, and backstitch. And continue sewing until you get to the other end and backstitch again. Alright, so we're going to sew up this waist seam one more time. So using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, go ahead and line up your fabric, lower your needle, begin sewing, and backstitch. Then you'll keep sewing until you get to the end and backstitch again. Alright, after you have sewn the waist seam, make sure you press the seam going up towards the bodice of the jacket. Alright, another thing that I did was, I know that I serged the edges earlier, but to reduce the bulk, I went ahead and serged the edge again, joining the two pieces, and that's helping it to lay a little bit flatter. Alright, next go ahead and grab 2 of your collar pieces and go ahead and apply the interfacing. Alright, next we need to pin and sew our collar pieces. So making sure that the 2 pieces that have interfacing are together and the 2 pieces that do not have interfacing are together. And then the right sides are facing on the inside. Go ahead and grab your pins, and along the neck area of the collar, we're going to pin this in place. Alright, to sew up the center back seam of the collar, Go ahead and line up the edge with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Lower your needle, begin sewing, and backstitch. And keep sewing until you get to the end and backstitch again. Alright, and you can go ahead and press this seam open. Alright, next go ahead and grab your 2 collar pieces. Lay one with the right side facing up. Take the other piece and lay it right on top. Grab your pins, and we're going to pin along the outer edge, and this is the side that does not have any notches. So we're going to pin along this upper edge here. So first go ahead and join where the 2 seams are in the collar. Go ahead and join those. And then you can begin adding additional pins along the outer edge. Also on the edge of the collar you want to put some pins as well. Alright, go ahead and line up the edge with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Lower your needle, begin sewing, backstitch. Alright, we're going to keep sewing until we get 5/8 of an inch away from the other end. Alright, when you're about 5/8 of away from the edge, go ahead and stop. Lift up your presser foot. Make sure your needle is left inside of your fabric. Go ahead and turn. Put your presser foot back down and keep sewing. Alright, when you get about 5/8 of an inch away, go ahead and stop. Lift up your presser foot and turn your fabric. Alright, next thing that we're going to do is clip the curve of our collar. So I'm just making cuts in the seam. And make sure that you don't cut through the stitches. Next, what you want to do is at the end of the collar, we want to cut the corner here. We'll do the other corner as well. Alright, after you have all of that finished, now you can go ahead and turn it to the right side. Alright, next what you're going to do is take this to your iron and you're going to give your collar a nice press. Alright, after you have your collar nice and pressed, what you want to do is take this to your sewing machine, and we're going to just baste this edge in place before we pin it to our jacket. So you can take this to your sewing machine and using a basting stitch to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance to baste this collar in place. Alright, the next thing that you want to do is lay out your coat with the right side facing up. So right now I'm looking at the back of the coat and the fronts are on the sides. Alright, next what you want to go ahead and do is lay the collar, the bottom edge of the collar, that's the basted edge. You want to make sure that the side that does not have interfacing, so I'm pinching it right here to check to see, and I can see that's the side without the interfacing. I'm going to lay that with the right side of the coat. So the first place that you want to go ahead and pin is at the center back. So line up the center back of the collar with the center back of the bodice, and you can pin in place. Alright, next thing you want to do is line up the next notch with the shoulder seam, and you want to pin in place there. Then you want to find the other notch down closer towards the bottom of the collar, and you're going to line that up with the waist seam, and you want to pin in place there. Next, you want to line up the bottom edge of the collar with that 5/8 of an inch dot down at the bottom, and you want to pin in place there. Alright, you're going to pin the other side the same exact way, and then you can add additional pins in between where we pinned for our notches and our dot, just to help to reinforce it some more. Alright, starting at the end of the collar, go ahead and line that up with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Go ahead and begin sewing and backstitch. And you want to keep sewing until you get to the other end of the collar and backstitch again. Alright, next thing that you want to go ahead and do is finish off this raw edge here of the collar. I'm going to go ahead and serge this edge. Alright, and then after you finish off that raw edge, go ahead and press the seam allowance going towards the jacket. Alright, before we baste the lower edge of our coat, we're going to go ahead and pin this lower edge out of the way. So right at the collar, there was that seam allowance. I'm just tucking it and pinning it in place. Next, what you want to go ahead and do is change your machine to a basting stitch. Line up the hem with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and go ahead and lower your needle. And there's no need to backstitch, just start sewing and continue sewing until you get to the other end. Alright, to do the hem, you want to make sure that the wrong side is facing up, and we're looking at the bottom edge. And you're folding on that 5/8 of an inch line. So you're just folding up your fabric on that line, and then you're taking your iron and pressing that out. Once you have done that all the way around, what you want to do is open up the hem, and you're turning it to meet that crease and also that stitch line, and then you're folding in again, taking your iron and pressing that in place. That's going to create a narrow hem. And then once you're done pressing, you can take it to we're going to take it to our sewing machine and do a top stitch to secure the hem in place. Alright, go ahead and line up the bottom edge with 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Make sure that you're on the right side of the fabric because we're doing a top stitch. Go ahead and lower your needle, begin sewing and backstitch, and continue sewing until you get to the other end and backstitch again. Alright, now you can go ahead and take this to your iron and give it a nice press. Alright, go ahead and lay out your sash, and we're going to pin along the center back. So make sure that you have the right sides facing each other, and you can go ahead and add some pins along this center back edge. Alright, go ahead and line up the center back of the sash with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Lower your needle and begin sewing. Backstitch. Keep sewing until you get to the end and backstitch again. Alright, and you can go ahead and press this seam open. Alright, looking at the sash, make sure that the right side of the fabric is facing up. What you want to do now is go ahead and fold this in half, and you want to line up the seams together, and you can place a pin. Alright, next what you want to do is from this center back seam, go ahead and measure over a couple of inches and place a pin. And then from this pin, measure over about 3 inches and place another pin. And I put these pins going in the opposite direction of how I'm going to actually start pinning these edges, because this is going to mark a starting point when we sew this way, and this will mark a sewing point when we start sewing this way. Alright, we're going to leave this space open in between these two pins so that we can flip our sash to the right side facing out. So next what I'm going to do is add some additional pins here. Alright, at one of your starting pins for the sash, go ahead and line up the edge with 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Go ahead and begin sewing and backstitch. Alright, when you get close towards the end, we're going to stop about 3/8 of an inch away. Okay, leave your needle in your fabric, lift up your presser foot, lift up your presser foot. Alright, lower your presser foot back down and keep sewing at 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now to do the other side, go ahead and now start at your other starting point and then sew up this side the same exact way that we did the other side. And just make sure that you have that opening in the center so that we can turn this to the right side facing out. Go ahead and clip the corner, the edge of your sash. Alright, now with this opening, you can go ahead and start start feeding the sash through that hole. Alright, and if necessary, you can go ahead and grab a pin, and right at that corner, at the end of the sash, you can use your pin to pick out that point. Alright, after you have turned your sash to the right side facing out, go ahead and give it a nice press, and then with that opening, you want to go ahead and grab a hand needle and go ahead and slip stitch this opening closed. After you're done with that, you are all finished.